Thanks, Lee, and look, thank you to the AIE for inviting me to speak tonight. I'd like to say it's an honour for me to be in the room. I don't ever consider myself an energy expert. I'm just somebody who hangs around with them and asks them what they know and then sort of tries to explain it to everybody else. So I'll try and do that again tonight, relaying back some observations that I'm making over the last few months back to you. Right. And obviously, after I finished the Australian Energy Council, the catharsis was I got to sit down and write a book, which got published last year. It's called Blackout. That's across the right there. It's fantastic. You know, the kids are all asking for Christmas. But it was great. It was interesting. I wrote it for a lay audience, and probably I wrote it to engage people who wanted to get their head around energy but weren't inside the industry. So for people like yourselves, it's probably it's a simple read. But I found it fascinating, particularly the history. It's just useful to go back and remember some of the stepwise progression of where the grid came from and why we are the way we are. And I want to use some of that tonight because probably the most useful thing I can share with you, I don't think I'm going to solve some of the technical issues. I'm an economist to start with. But I've sort of worked in the political and market space over the past 15 years on this, and I'm really interested in why we're stuck, because we all accept that that political impasse is wreaking havoc, and it's not just one, it's both major parties are sort of stuck in their own different but related paradigms, and they partly feed off each other. So if nothing else, just to try and, I've got an idea on that which I'll try and explain, and that may be useful for you in thinking about how we solve for that, because, well, we're at the moment sort of facing reform through institutions, and so we have kind of this gradual shuffle towards central planning being promoted by the market operator, which needs to do that to keep the lights on. We've never had a debate about whether that's a good idea or not. We're just building the assets which then potentially trigger other assets closing or other opportunities arising. And this is kind of done without there necessarily being a considered approach to the consequences of that. And it would be useful if we had some overarching guidance from governments that coordinated this. And ideally, the dream ticket is that we get the politicians back out of the running machine, and we let it be run by the experts who run it. And they just tell us the target that they want us to reach, and let the machine then solve for that. Anyway, that's the dreamy stuff. So I'll begin. 4 sort of basic topics I want to run through tonight. The first is the politics, and then the machine itself, because they're consequent. Like the politics frames the debate, the machine is the thing that we are transforming. The market is the mechanism by which we drive that transformation. The governance is how we organise the market. And one follows the other. I don't think you can design governance until you've agreed which machine you're planning on building and which market you're planning on having governance for. And so the problem is that's a very rational way of considering this, but we're having a governance debate in parallel to a market debate while we haven't quite agreed on what the machine looks like, while the politicians aren't really particularly committed to a coordinated strategy to execute against this. One of the useful things to think about, this came up in conversations earlier today, in my sort of early life as a journalist, I met a guy called Mark Lewis, who was at the time in 2008 working at Deutsche Bank in Paris, and he did some of the early heavy lifting on what is the value of a tonne of CO2, and if we accept the scarcity value of CO2, and he basically back then calculated that the global scarcity value of CO2 is around 100 US a tonne. And that means about $140 Australian. So in a sense, that's what the true value of emitting CO2 is by everything we do. And that frames the critical nature of what we have in front of us, because we're not paying that price. The European carbon price is well below that. We don't want to pay that price if we can avoid it, but by definition, that's what we'll be pricing carbon at if we value its scarcity appropriately. So with this in mind, it's a useful time to think about the politics, because we've recently just had the bushfires and in the last 24 hours debate in federal politics about sort of a grievance motion about the bushfires, and that's important because you would think an event like that would be a natural trigger for a political reaction, and I'll discuss that, but I don't think it is anymore. And that's changed. When I was at the Australian in 2006, 2007, you recall the Millennium Drought. And that was basically, importantly, that was triggered by a large El Nino event, and we had water levels in dams, in particularly Sydney and Melbourne, fall to around 25 and 30% respectively. And water restrictions were so tight that you couldn't water your garden and you couldn't fill your pool. And that was the first time that suburban punterland Australia engaged climate change. And that drove the Howard government to a radical shift in policy. And because the public thought, Al Gore's movie just come out, the public suddenly thought, my God, climate change is happening right now and it's materially affecting the quality of my life right now. And we saw a really radical change in the policy response. And then of course, Brad got elected, we had an emissions trading scheme proposed, a renewable energy target proposed, which got through, and then the GFC hit and plans for a global agreement at Copenhagen were parked, and we've never returned to that point since. And I would argue that the second time the public has been engaged on climate change is just happened. And so the reason why I think it's significant is for the, kids couldn't play sport on Saturday because the smoke was so bad from the bush. That's what changes the public dynamic on this. It's not articles in the Australian, it's not the Financial Review, it's not Q&A. It's when their own lives are changed by events. And the difference this time is that is not driving the same policy response, and I'm going to argue I don't think it will. And I want to explain why. So, let's get there. The other thing to note is, I'll explain that. Okay. So I actually think it's important not to politics has changed. It's changed in my lifetime. I was a young journalist when John Bannon was Premier of South Australia before he invested in the State Bank. That didn't go so well. But it's changed materially in our lifetimes. And it's changed, the kind of people going into politics have changed and the engagement of the public has changed. And I kind of reference this to what I call password relationships. So you think about your parents, and I reckon they had half a dozen password relationships. They had a bank account, they had a phone bill, they had a power bill, they paid a rates notice, they had a couple of other sort of things they managed. My parents weren't very good at managing half a dozen, but they only had 6. And you think about your life today and how many password relationships you and your family have. And it would number 30 or 40. You have Netflix accounts, you have Wi-Fi accounts, you have an account with Apple, you have, and you just go back and track through them. So life is busier, it's more complex, there's more traffic on the roads, the public is more distracted, it has devices, you're trying to get kids off iPhones, all those things we know. And then you have a media which is degraded because the financing, the funding model for the media has changed. And the public are getting a poorer quality service because there's less resources thrown at it. When I was a young journo, you could just fly around Australia. If something happened, I covered this first solar car race from Darwin to Adelaide. And we said, look, we just need to get in a plane and fly up to Darwin to track this car. And they said, yep, off you go, no problems. Because newspapers printed money. They had just classified advertising all the way through them. Today, there's no staff left. They're basically running on the smell of an oily rag, and that's reflected in the public engagement in media. So governments aren't held to the same account as they were when we were growing up, and that's changed the nature of this political discourse. So politics really simplifies policy debates, and particularly complex debates like energy. And in the political world, the environment is a cause. And the electricity system is a machine that provides a service. And that's how it is perceived. Labor relates to the cause. Labor relates to the idea of changing the world and making the world a better place. It's a cause-driven political paradigm. That's not to say they don't understand the machine bit, but their politics is driven by the cause. That's in part because if they don't, the Greens do, so they protect their base by sort of reflecting that cause nature. The coalition reflects this debate by talking about the machine and the service. Now, Labor acknowledges it's a machine, the coalition acknowledges there's some environmental constraints, but their focus is at either ends of that sort of dynamic, and that's important. Why that's significant is, I have a picture of Greenpeace there, that's from 1971. what happened, what happened through the 20th century. The environment was originally run as a conservation movement. So if you think back to, when I was a kid anyway, which is quite a while ago now, but conservation was a conservative activity. The president of the WWF was Prince Philip. The first president of the Australian Conservation Foundation was Sir Garfield Barwick, and he was the conservative that sacked off Whitlam in 1975. Baggy shorts, looking after bits of land, looking after sort of protecting stability, protecting the ability for the natural environment to have places to grow. That's what was considered environmentalism until the 60s and 70s. Greenpeace was spawned out of the peace movement. That was anti-war, Vietnam, civil rights, the changes that were wrought in the 60s. And it was a completely recast the way we thought about the environment. It miscast the way we thought about the environment. It's not the fault of the activists. It was cast as activism and as a sort of a change agent, which is what activists do. But we've perceived the environment to be a cause when it's not. And we're hitting that problem now in energy markets because we're trying to incorporate genuine systemic reform in a machine, and one party gives us cause-based targets and sort of trying to change the world, while the other one recants against that. And that's the political dynamic that we're dealing with right now. So, you get the moral challenge versus lower prices. That's how it's played out. In the cartoon of politics, that works for the left and that works for the right. And it's that simple. It's that simple. And so you go and talk to the coalition about, we need to, this is critical, it's important. They go, yeah, but we're focused on that. In the same way, if you go to the Victorian government and you say, listen, we get that the morality of the importance of renewables, but we need some machines to firm the renewables to keep the lights on. And they go, yeah, we're just going to stick to the renewables for now. That's kind of what we can sell and what we can live with. And that's the problem we have. And both of them are giving us a partial solution, but both, they're not, that's the problem. They're not meeting in the middle. So I was just, when I was preparing for this, I just thought it's really simple stuff. I went back to the Coalition's energy policy, which was a 4-page document produced in April last year. It doesn't say climate change once. It's an energy document written in 2019 and it doesn't say climate change once. And if you go back and read transcripts of speeches by senior ministers, the words climate change, they do not say the words climate change. They talk about prices, they talk about emissions, where we need to get some emissions down, we need to make our targets. So the policy platform is basically to keep power reliable, secure and stable. We need to get the machine working. Consumers come first. We're going to have a go at the big businesses that are rorting you, and we're going to meet our commitments, not particularly high, but we're going to make sure we smash our targets. So we're going to look like we're doing our job on those commitments. So it's a machine-based approach. And they're quite comfortable with that. It works for them. Their current strategy is to sustain that process. By contrast, if you look at Victoria, which is probably the template for the opposite, you've got the VRET, which is industrial activism. It works to their base. They're saying we've got a very aggressive renewable energy target, and we're going to build renewables because people like them, and that changes everything. If you dig into the nomenclature of the VRET scheme, they talk about a wind farm hiring 470 people. Now, I'm not sure what sort of wind farm has 470 people working at it, but I can't, it's nonsense. Of course, they're deliberately blurring people that are hired at any point in the build process and just kind of working the words to make the inference that there's all these green jobs being created at wind farms and solar farms. It's not true. They're temporary jobs for building, that's fine. Renewables are terrific because they don't employ people. It keeps the cost down, it keeps them safer. It's one of the features of the technology. But it works for that narrative to talk about green jobs, regional jobs, Victorian jobs, investment. It's a type of activism. Because it's not because they don't understand those features, they're selling to their base and what they need to get done. Now the frustration is you go and meet with them and say, we need to talk about, we need some gas peakers. to go with this big bank of wind farms and solar farms. And we've just put a moratorium on gas. Gas is bad. Gas is a moral choice, and we don't want to be associated with a conflict of our paradigm. So you have big renewables over here, and let's get prices down, and let's make the machine work better over here. And neither is a coherent strategy for what we need. And of course, the more extreme they get, the more they react. So the coalition think, those voices in the coalition that still carry weight, and there are plenty of them, they still think that climate change is one of these, a hobby horse. So activists are sort of inflating and exaggerating the consequences and talking about all these things that, that Greenpeace and all these guys sort of bang on about. It's sort of all a bit inflated. We just need to get the machine to work. That's really what's important. They don't buy it. I mean, and some of them, Senator Jim Boylan was on Q&A Monday night openly saying, I question the science, and it's a moral choice. They're saying, look, I've never trusted these guys, and I'm not going to start trusting them now. My instinct is that this is being overstated. So appealing to them on that basis isn't going to work, because they see this as not as a technical or as a risk-based issue. They see it from the perspective that it's an opinion, it's a moral judgment that they can make. And Labor does the same thing in reverse. So on Friday, when we nearly had a system break in South Australia, in the evening it's pretty hot and very humid, very still in Victoria, when the sun was setting, I think 76-77% of generation in Victoria was coming from gas and coal. Now you'll never get the Victorian government saying, thank God for the gas and the coal. Really, they just wait, they sort of block those moments out of their narrative as if they don't exist, and then criticise coal units for tripping, which may have caused a blackout. So it's kind of it's a deliberately partial, it's very frustrating. It's okay to say, look, we're great, we need to replace those assets, so we're going to need some serious investment to make this work in the future. That's not their story. Their story is bad guys, good guys. It's a cartoon. And that's because that's all the public are willing can comprehend. I was at a cafe today, I was at a cafe having a chat with someone who's here, and this woman was overhearing our conversation about energy, and she sort of leant in and said, it's all the coal subsidies. If they stop subsidising, people hold strong opinions about stuff which is not necessarily accurate. And that's what political parties are dealing with. So appealing to their rational sense isn't going to work in this political dynamic. The problem is what does work. And we've spent the past 10 years trying to coerce and convince governments to get together and sort this out, because we can see prices increasing, reliability falling, and we're not doing any of the things we need to do. And we are failing in getting them across the line. And I don't have a solution for you, because I spent 10 years failing to do this, except for the rep, and so far we haven't found a way through. But understanding this is, I think if you're waiting for this government, I don't see anything that the Morrison government has said since the bushfires which suggests that they're going to copy John Howard circa 2006 and make a substantial policy change on climate change. I see nothing. And I don't know the Prime Minister, and but I can see from the way he's positioning his rhetoric very carefully. I think there'll be the logical thing is you do need to separate out abatement, mitigation from adaptation, and there'll be a lot of money spent on increased funding for fire, for emergency services, and more planes to put out fires, and all that kind of coping with the warming. I think that is no-brainer that will occur, and that should occur. So that's responsible. And they will argue correctly that Australia could reduce its emissions to zero, and that will do nothing to change the climate conditions. And more worrying is, there was a paper put out by SARO a couple of weeks ago where they said the problem with this bushfire is it's not an El Nino event causing these dry conditions, so it could get worse. If we get an El Nino combined with these conditions, then we get even hotter and drier conditions again. So they'll say there's nothing we can do to change that. It's a global problem, but we can adapt to a hotter and warmer climate, and we'll do that. And They may talk about changing or making some modest adjustments to international commitments, and they will talk about technology. And the problem, nothing wrong with talking about technology, but we've been talking about technology for 20 years, and technology doesn't solve the technical issues we face in maintaining a reliable and sustainable grid in the 21st century. Now we know that, and they know that, but that's what they think they can sell and get away with. And it will start raining, the footy season will begin, and the hope is that this will ease as a political issue and people will be overtaken by other factors. And maybe it comes back next summer, maybe it doesn't, and they'll roll those dice. So, that's the good news. Those things can change, but I think that also, I'll just observe, they've watched what happened to John Howard in 2006. And Howard didn't have time to react and time to sit it out, and he moved quickly. He lost his seat and he lost the election in a landslide. So changing doesn't necessarily get you anywhere. It doesn't win you back. And it also can create a sense of guilt. If you move after the bushfires, it's as if you infer that you are responsible for bushfires. And that doesn't work really. So if they do move, they may move in a way that's detached from the bushfire so that they don't have a causal link between the two. But I don't think we should assume that that's going to, I think an event like that is not driving change. Okay, so the next sequencing is the three, which is the machine. What is this? What do we need to do with this machine? The electricity system in the NEM, the market to run it, and then the governance that oversights it. So Blue Waters was built in 2009, upgraded in 2010 in WA. Is it the last coal-fired power station to be built in Australia? The answer, I think, probably lies here in Queensland at the next state election. I don't see any other state government remotely interested in going down this path. It would need to be completely funded by state and or federal governments, and they both need to be on the same page to get there. The last window of opportunity might be if the LNP was elected here in Queensland in September. But having sort of read through their policy platform, it doesn't appear to me to have a strong predilection towards funding new coal-fired generation, which is right, because there's no demand, there's no need for new coal-fired generation at the moment in Queensland. So I think that's unlikely, but that's probably the last chance. Am I doing something to no. Okay. So, but I think that's it. So if we accept the premise, which I think is reasonable at this point, I think the premise that new coal is almost at the concept, the likelihood of new coal is approaching zero. Okay. So we have kind of two relatively binary choices. We can build a nuclear grid, or we can build a renewables-based grid. They're not particularly compatible. You might be able to use nuclear a bit at the edges of a renewable grid. And we can sort of use a variation of the energy market we currently have, or something which is a variant of the capacity market. So it might be reserve capacity market, a whole lot of iterations there, which is really a higher intervention model, which is driven by an anxiety about investment not occurring at the pace required, and therefore you direct and accelerate investment using those kind of measures. And I don't know the answer to either of these questions, but that's probably they're the choices we've got. So I just did some quick back-of-the-envelope calculations on the choice between the two machines. Nuclear basically looks like a variation of the coal-based grid around 2000. So it's a whole bunch of coal-fired power stations backed by hydro and pumped hydro. You can, Snow 2.0 is quite useful in this case, and it's that, as is battery of the nation, if you build that, you can get there. The problem with nuclear, holding a lot of things to constant is its cost. So if you work on the cost of the most recent nuclear generators built in Atlanta, they're eye-wateringly expensive, and if you apply that metric and scale it up to the size of the NEM, it's around $5-7 billion to build a nuclear grid at that scale. So now that's why the debate around the small modular reactors is so important, because they're talking about how smaller reactors, which is counterintuitive for an economist, but smaller reactors might be cheaper and more efficient. I'm not a nuclear scientist, but I've just finished reading the book on Chernobyl, which is great, the one that triggered this TV series. And the Soviets did the wrong thing. They built giant reactors to try and bring costs down, and they found inside the reactors that the heat was quite different in different parts because it was so large. They had real difficulty controlling the heat inside the reactor because it was too big. So I have no sense on whether this is going to work at a smaller scale. And we won't know until at least 2026 when the first small modular reactor is supposed to be built. But let's just go with the idea that that's a possibility, and it's kind of like the wicket keeper. I think we will end up trying to build a renewable grid, and if it's not working, then we will start taking this more seriously. Now, whether we have enough time to build, scale up and do that, I don't know, but that's probably the sequence of events. The renewable grid, and there's a really interesting literature on this, and I've raised it with Paul and others briefly, and AEMO's picked up on it too. Renewables, if you're going to build a 50 gigawatt grid, you have to double build the intermittent generation because there's not enough power, because it's intermittent, there's not enough power in it singularly. And AEMO has said the same thing in its recent draft ISP for 2020. So the point of that, why it's significant, is you obviously need more renewables. So we've built about 25 gig of renewables so far behind the red. We're going to have to quadruple that by 2050. So that's about 2,500 megawatts a year every year for the rest of our lives to get there. But moreover, then the debate is how much storage do you need to build to support that, and that's an open question subject to your load profile. But I've gone with about 30 gig on the international literature. No one knows because no one's done it, but it's an open question as to, in general, the idea is that you overbuild renewables because it's cheaper to overbuild renewables as much as possible rather than trying to build storage, optimising the storage. So where possible, you overbuild renewables. I think that's right. There seems to be a general sense that you do need some scale of engine. It's a small engine in this because you do have periods of low generation, sustained periods of low wind and sun, and you need to be able to keep recharging the system and maintaining it for high peaks. So there's some small engines, say 10 gig gas spread across or nuclear or something else, or hydrogen. And then there's demand management, which is again, how that's really an open question. How much demand management can you bring to the system? And I would observe that the Australian grid's fairly poor it's fairly infantile in its adoption of demand management, and that's a legacy of the type of grid we've run in the 20th century, but we're going to have to get a lot better at it if we're going to run that kind of grid. And we're seeing that with the way in which AEMO is being forced to use the word on fairly regular occasions through this summer, which is expensive demand management, and we probably need to be a bit more flexible on that side. Just in case you weren't aware, the nuclear storage core, because we did start building one in 1969. This is just near Jarvis Bay called Murray's Beach, and this is a car park for Murray's Beach, and that's Murray's Beach. It's quite secluded. That was the concrete pad that was poured for a 500 megawatt nuclear power station. And it was proposed, I think, by the Gorton or Martin government, I've just forgotten, because they were looking at Australia having nuclear weapons capacity, and so to do that you need plutonium to be able to build those weapons. So you need a nuclear power station to produce that. So they started building it, and then Treasury came back, and because at that time the ACT was controlled by the federal government, so they didn't have to get state government approval. And then Treasury came back and gave them a costing how much it would cost to finish it, and it was pretty expensive, so they just stopped building. So it's now a car park for a beach. But it's one of those little mysteries that it's just forgotten in the history of Australian energy. Okay, so the other kind of weird thing, and I think this is really super strange, but we are currently the world record. If there was a per capita Olympics in energy, we'd be on the podium for a bunch of stuff. So we'd be on the podium for renewables per capita. We've passed the kilowatt per capita club. There's only 3 countries, I think, that are there for intermittent renewables. That's Germany, Denmark, and Australia. So we're the bronze. We're on the podium for emissions per capita, of course, still. So although that will be falling as renewables kick in, but we're certainly still at high emissions. And we're a world record. We're winning in terms of the rate of deploy at the moment as we get towards the end of the RET term. So we're probably building at a faster rate than we need to, but it's a fairly aggressive build rate across the net. And there is no sign from this federal government that they're interested particularly in any policy measures to support or sustain that renewables build. So from here on in, it will be a market-based, whatever the market is, deploy further renewables. And that clearly gets challenging because Again, there are a million rabbit holes to run down. One of the interesting technical debates that's broken out in the last 12 months to 18 months is the level of correlation or negative correlation between different renewables. So how correlated, particularly obviously the solar is correlated across southeastern Australia, but how negatively or positively correlated are wind generators across southeastern Australia. And the work done today suggests there's a positive correlation, not a negative correlation, which is bad, because they will tend to produce at the same time and they will tend to suppress prices unless there's a lot of storage basically, or some demand is put in to soak up those times of surplus demand. Now, Paul's written a recent paper which I think is right, which of course rationally you allow for that and you switch the renewables off at those times of negative pricing, which makes sense. But if you want to scale up, you can't scale up this renewables grid without there being something at very large scale like Snow 2.0 on steroids, soaking up all that surplus demand and dispatching it at times of peak demand. So you can use gas peakers as a short to medium measure, but you're going to need storage at scale to run the renewables grid. So the real issue here in terms of market design is how if you are going to some sort of more regulated, how do you pick a winner? Because without there being some framing, right now the grid is effectively being built by sort of a strange amalgam of some businesses taking risks, AEMO kind of pushing different transmission and other sort of rule changes around the place. There's a whole series of events occurring that are kind of mangling an outcome. And I recently wrote about the South Australia-New South Wales interconnector, which is a really important and fascinating decision because effectively we made a decision to put a $1.5 billion bit of kit in, which will materially change the direction of the grid, and no one's quite sure what's going to happen. But we're still doing it anyway. The Electronet sort of identified a benefit of nearly $1 billion. The regulator dialed that down to about 250 to 60 million, which is a big change. And at that level, there are so many assumptions in that consideration that it could go either way. It could be a great decision, it could be a less great decision. We won't know till the end of this decade, by which time it'll be too late. So you've got renewables on their own around $50 a megawatt hour, which is, and still falling, which is going to be important. You've got, and this is based off, again, quoting Paul here, is a recent paper, renewables firmed by gas, so 70 to 80, which is kind of, if you look at the politics, it's probably the sweet spot at the moment, because that's where you can probably you can maintain the existing wholesale market price, and you can get a significant drop in emissions, and you're not going to materially impact price, you're not going to prices down. When you start getting to renewables firmed by batteries or firmed by pumped hydro, these are numbers that I've quoted directly from the range from CSIRO, but I'm not sure that CSIRO is factored in the double bill on renewables, because if you're really going for like, those numbers are higher, and which is why it's so important that renewables cost and these technology costs keep falling, because we're going to need that to get as low as possible to make the transition as bearable as possible, because ultimately that's what you're going to have to do if you're building if you're going to get to zero emissions by 2050. So the point being, without some guidance on, significant guidance on emissions, it's really hard to make decisions to which, you build on this if there's no guidance on emissions. If you're trying to build this new grid, at some point you're going to have a price signal or other signal on emissions to create the investment for those assets that we need to build. Now, when you look at the ISP, it certainly is evolving into it looks like more central planning. It's a fairly clear program of transmission connecting to a series of renewable energy zones, which logically makes sense because the scale at which we're going to have to build renewables to build this grid requires that we're going to be building them a lot of renewables across eastern Australia. And the challenge, so AEMO is quite rational in sort of saying, well, this is what you need to do, so here's how we see it rolling out, which makes sense to me at one level, but it's extremely directive at the other level. And the concern you always have with central planning is ultimately a singular vision of what might happen, and it doesn't allow for all the other interesting and cool things that markets discover along the way. The question is, and I think this is an open question for this industry, is can you afford to not follow this blueprint, because can you rely on the market to kind of get the same sort of outcomes or better outcomes? The rooms generally divide along this. This is the Jets and the Sharks in the electricity industry. So it really does divide everybody, and there are people who used to be jets all their lives who are now sharks, and sharks are turning into jets. And I don't know the answer, but it's material, and so it frames the tension between the market operator and the commission, because the commission is the protector of the market-based solution, and the market operator already says, look, that's neat, but this is just way past the point where we can rely on that to occur. There's too much interference. We need to go with plan B, and this is plan B. And in looking at this is unsubsidised new capacity as a share of investment per annum, and basically since 2012, the only bit of kit, and actually I'm mistaken because there's a few small batteries including poles, but the only kit that's really been built without any underwriting apart from those small batteries is the Barker Inlet reciprocating engine that was put into South Australia, and really in a sense that's replacing Torrens Island Tips A, which is coming out. So it's not really new build, it's replacement build, but still it was built without support. But the question is that the new normal, or is that just a function of a series of events which will rectify themselves if we're allowed to be fixed? And I've read papers saying both, and I don't know which way it goes. But right now that doesn't inspire confidence in there being, and that's a function to some extent of the REC being sort of driving investment in subsidised renewables. Does this self-correct if you allow the market headroom to go back and do what it needs to do? And things like the VREP, like Snow 2.0, are clearly materially impacting investment, the bankability of otherwise ready-to-go projects in those jurisdictions. And the interconnector would, I think, the chance of getting any new capacity put into South Australia without someone underwriting it with the new interconnector only would have been pretty low. The other kind of big, these are macro changes, let alone sort of, I haven't got time to go through things like Kagadi and Undy in any great detail, but the post-2025 review, it's really, that's another risk because it potentially changes the value of every asset in the net, subject to what that review, and no matter what you do, and Claire in drafting some of that stuff has been at pains to point out the risk involved in just considering this review has a risk of stalling investment. And they've done everything they can to try to avoid that, but it's very hard to do that because it changes the value of potentially everything. And I sort of, I don't think it's a bad idea, but the question I would just raise is, do we really think that are we going to frame reforms which are sufficiently palatable to get through the current political impasse? It's possible, but it's by no means certain. And then finally, to governance, this picture of Game of Thrones, I think governance is challenging, but I think it's impossible to design governance reform. There's a review of the Energy Security Board this year. I don't know what you do with governance till you've actually answered some of those questions about the machine you're proposing to build in the market that you're proposing, because your governance should be a function of the market that it's put in place to govern. I would simply also raise another simple observation, which doesn't ever get spoken and maybe should, is that maybe the Think review wasn't perfect, and that we all, the general view across most of the industry was at the time, and I think, by the way, I think Alan did an outstanding job, and I think his ability to get his head around a complex set of issues and produce a report of that quality was outstanding. But he made 50 recommendations, and within the industry, when I was at the Energy Council, a number of people had concerns about specific recommendations, but they said, look, we're really after getting the clean energy target and those big macro reforms through, so we'll ignore the small stuff and hope we get those big ones through. And in the end, it's like kind of trying to feed a tablet to a dog. We spat out the thing we wanted, and we got all the other reforms without really debating the merits of them. So one of those things is the creation of the Energy Security Board, which is designed, Alan said, look, you guys have got to work together better. The problem with that is that you've created this dynamic where you artificially broker agreement between agencies that are designed to disagree. They're designed to disagree. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. So to sort of say you have to come to some compromise may not be the best outcome for the designer. We've never really had this discussion, we just waved this through, and we're now living with this structure, which may or may not be the right way to go. But I doubt there'll be any will to reform the Energy Security Board because politicians love it, because it gives them a single entity to take advice from, which they think has more authority than asking the Commission or asking the market operator or the regulator to do the same thing. It's not a reflection on the behaviour of the agents in that board. I think they all do an outstanding job as the nature of that discussion. So the future, it's rollable. I just generally think status quo, there's a lot of stasis in this dynamic, and I think the status quo holds. So if you think, the REIT isn't going to get replaced. The VREIT is going to continue. There are some things which are a bit harder to guess. So, UNGI was an idea posed at the beginning of last year. It invited shortlist at 66 applicants. They were shortlisted to 12. I still haven't seen the criteria on which those shortlistings were made. I don't know whether, under one design, UNGI is a very useful way of getting critical infrastructure built. On the other, it just adds to the risk of the market being able to solve for itself, and the more you do this, the worse it gets. But I think it's just going to roll forwards in a way, whichever way it does, and we'll see UNGI projects pop up. We don't even know how many and how much they're going to be. It will just continue. The Victoria, the Clean Code will continue unless the government changes. If I was reading what I think the LNP might do, I think they would retain 3 generators, but they might blend the mix of assets between 3 generators. That would fit what they're doing, but I'm just guessing. But I think those, and whether those targets remain is unclear. There'll be a market review post 2025. There'll be the review of the ESP. We'll have a new chair of the commission, I think. It's still possible John stays, but likely there'll be a new chair, and that will significantly inform where that agency goes and how it works with other agencies. And I think we'll have more of this punitive anti. It's an easy sell to say these guys are ripping you off, and we're seeing a lot of that sort of anti-business. To the point where some businesses are basically shut out of processes because they're not allowed to be. It's like saying to Coles and Woolworths, no more supermarkets for you for a while. We're going to build suburbs and someone else can provide them groceries. It's kind of that level of intervention. That's apparently okay. I'm not sure that's good. And I think the conventional economic issues are likely to remain unresolved. I think there's no ambition here to price externalities. There's no sort of idea that we're going to do this efficiently. It's just, I think we're going to see a series of band-aid responses to try and keep the lights on, suppress and keep power prices balanced as much as possible, but it will be direct intervention. And I think we'll have a rational exploration of design. I think there'll be a useful conversation about how you design electricity markets. I haven't seen anyone produce. The Germans have dabbled with a few different designs out of Europe in particular and some of the US grids. Nothing that I've seen suggests that someone's worked that out. So the problem we've got is we're going to have to proceed or not proceed on that basis, and if no one's given us a really clear ticket, we will probably just adapt what we've got. And look, I'm a personal advocate. I think the dream ticket is if we could get a sort of a governance model which looks more like the Reserve Bank and sort of separates political decisions from the way the grid is run, and all they'll have to do is tell us the targets that they require emissions to be, and then we will deliver that at the reliability standard that's been prescribed at the lowest possible cost. That's the fantasy. I don't think it's going to happen, but logically I think this requires a fairly comprehensive reform of governance to do that. That requires thinking about all those other factors first. When we talk about technology, the risk is, we've been talking about technology and investing and driving technology for 2 decades, and we're going to need to keep doing it. The risk is just talking about technology is the risk of look busy work. So let's talk about hydrogen some more. Hydrogen's really interesting. Let's get a hydrogen agency to do more. Let's call press releases on hydrogen. Let's put some hydrogen in a ship and send it to Japan and take photos of it. Hydrogen and all these other things should be developed and progressed, but let's not use that as an excuse to reform the machine we're running right now. And I just don't think I've been reading about the solar thermal businesses, and one in the US that was going to build a solar thermal plant in South Australia, and it's now basically going to the wall. And that's because it can't compete with the price, the cost of solar PV. So that's kind of great. We're now, and I think we have to. The value of heat has changed. So solar hot water systems. It might be better to use hot water tanks, using electricity to heat hot water tanks, and cheaper and more efficient than to use heat from rooftops. That's a useful development if it occurs. So we're just really bad at breaking up with ideas that didn't work or that partially worked. The geothermal dragged on for years after everyone knew that geothermal wasn't really going to be a game changer in the market. And what worries me is we've still got this kind of idea that these sort of magic technologies are going to come and make everything better and we don't have to do anything. I don't think that's real. And I would observe the great contribution we're going to make as a country to this transformation is we're forced to pioneer high renewables integration in large-scale grids. We're doing it. I mean, I can't find other countries in the world that are putting synchronous condensers into their grids at the scale we are, which suggests we're kind of on the cutting edge and we're going to keep solving for that over the next decade or two. And that will help guide. I was in Portugal talking to sort of an annual meeting of utilities and associations when the system black occurred. And the day before that system black occurred, we were presenting on South Australia and how kind of fragile it was becoming and no one was quite sure what was going to happen next. And that night it went system black. And the next morning we came back and I said, wow, you weren't kidding. They watch closely what's happening in Australia, not because they think we're terrific, because they think we're crazy. But the world is watching because they want to make sure they don't make the same mistakes that we do. And it's a valuable lesson, and that and we are going to pioneer this. So let's just do that well, and that will be our great contribution. So I've got some questions for you. As much I'm curious about things like the RRO, the mechanics of that. I'm trying to work out how you take a legal obligation to a bank and get new generation financed under that arrangement, if that's what you think it is. Where UNGI goes, the policy impact of the Queensland election. This is coming away. I think I'm standing on something. The impact of the SA New South Wales interconnector and what happens to renewables investment as the REF dials back. I think these are all open-ended questions and we're all wrestling with them. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on it. Thank you.
So we might have maybe 15 minutes of questions. And let's do our kick-off.
I'll ask a question.
Just a name of your question.
My name is Nick Apostolides. I'm a retired engineer and I'm a water engineer. And in fact, you mentioned water, and actually Australia led the world during the drought in actually coming up with technical solutions, both demand side and supply side, to address the issue. One thing that's not happening here, like demand management in electricity, is missing in action. No one talks about it. So I think there's a big area. My question is, it's more comment actually. There's so much focus on believers and unbelievers, and very little on actually solutions. In fact, there are so many solutions. If we can actually get a lot more dialogue. You said there's technologies. There is technologies. We don't have to invent any new ones. There are actually a lot of solutions. I think suddenly people will, there'll be a competition for who's got the best solution. I think it's quite a solvable problem. The ANU, for example, came up with a scheme to have zero using renewables with pump hydro at about 250 billion, which is close to what you mentioned. That is a fantastic opportunity. Someone should be talking and explaining what this is to the average punter, because that's missing in action.
Look, I agree. I mean, I think the report you're referencing is the ANU did some mapping of where you could put pumped hydro, which is it's different from actually building it or finding. And I think that the tricky bit is trying to model the arbitrage, because I remember a couple of years ago the owners of the Neon wind farm who basically won the lottery when they got the batteries stuck into the backyard of their wind farm. And that was because they had a connection agreement ready to go, so they kind of they did well. They observed that they were going to do very well out of that commercially, but that the second battery would do less well because, of course, it always gets hard. And this is the problem of the arbitrage model as an underpinning part of the grid, is a bank isn't going to finance that till they can see how that's going to work in practice, and we don't really have clarity around that yet. So the question is, what do you do about that? Do you underwrite the first batteries, and or when do you stop underwriting those technologies? How do you make them work commercially? Do you design a contracting arrangement that they're forced to be attached to a certain level of capacity of intermittent generation? And we'll learn a little bit about that perhaps from Clean Code if it continues, because they're going to be testing renewables being attached to things like wave and home, seeing how that works as they sort of scale that relationship up. So that will be interesting. But I think there's a lot of deep. That's to me what we should be. That's what we're going to be doing. So why don't we get on with it and accelerate that, because they're pretty useful questions. Because we need to put to bed what you need to build this kind of renewables grid if it's going to work. And we have a fairly isolated grid. But we do have lots of wind and sun, so we can do it. So that's probably a very useful contribution. We're not going to invent plain steel here. We're not going to invent systems to make aluminium more adaptable to loads. We just don't have those industries at scale to warrant that investment. But we are going to be forced to do this, and we should be doing it as aggressively and informed way as we can.
Shrek?
Yes, hello, Michael Van Baal from a startup called AIE Fuels. It's a good presentation, thank you. But I was just going to comment that I've been preparing some submissions lately and looking through the Australian energy statistics. And I was quite surprised, for example, in 2017, 2018 year, that we used twice as much diesel as we use electricity. And in fact, if you add all the other fuels and gas that we use for non-power generation, it's 4 times as much fossil fuels for direct use as we use electricity. So if you were going to do something like Britain's talked about by talking about being net zero emissions by 2050, actually the grid is only a small starting point, and ultimately I think the number is something like in that year we used 232 terawatt hours of electricity, and we burnt 924 terawatt hours of fuel, of various types. So in some ways it's a much broader discussion, isn't it, that we need to be having, because the grid is actually only is a quarter the size of the fuel combustion we're doing for other things.
Yeah, I thought it was about a third, but the same, because it sort of doesn't matter in the sense.
Yeah, no, it's a quarter. I think where a lot of people get confused is that it's often broken up by sectors. And what I found very enlightening was to actually break it down by fuel type that we use. And then it doesn't matter whether that's fuel is being used in transportation or whether it's being used in industry. In fact, I was amazed how much diesel is used in manufacturing, under the manufacturing sector. I thought there'd be much more diesel used in mining, for example. I think actually manufacturing beat mining, which I just want to know more than what's happening. But that's the scale of the problem, and if you are then going to use electricity to either electrify directly or indirectly to overcome that problem, you're going to have to ramp up the power system to something the size of Japan's currently. In other words, over 1,000 terawatt hours over the next 20 to 30 years. That's probably the scale of the issue, if we're framing that debate.
Look, if you're going to be positive about it, I think agriculture is going to be tricky. There's practices that can be applied, but measuring and reporting is particular. But I mean, the public just want this fixed. Like they don't want to know how the electricity system works. They're not buying my book in anywhere numbers that are big enough to suggest that that's the case. Disappointing, but true. They just want it to work, and I liken it to air traffic control. I just think for this industry, like I jump on a plane, I don't want to know how those guys do it. I just want the thing not to hit another plane, and I expect 100% performance from them. And so far, that's so good. And I think that's their view is, look, you're the experts, fix it. I don't want to pay a fortune, and I want somebody to tell me this is getting better, and I can stop being anxious about it. I can tell my kids. My kids are anxious about climate change. I don't think that's necessarily helpful, but it's honest. Like I wouldn't want to be 10 years old we grew up, I mean, again, looking at the room, a lot of us grew up with the fear of nuclear war. I had many sleepless nights thinking that Adelaide was a prime target for the Soviets, and naturally, and that was an anxiety we lived with, but that kind of abated. But these kids are going to be living with this kind of anxiety for as long as we continue to not get our stuff together. And I think the public simply want this to be fixed, and so in a sense, it's relatively fixable, providing you can find that point where you just go, look, it's actually we're on this pathway. And it's going to keep solving itself over the next 20 years. And they go, great, now can I get back to Game of Thrones and America's Got Talent? Because that's what I want to be doing. I don't want to be thinking about, should I be investing in this kind of technology or that kind of technology. So yeah, they want it to be expert-led. And I think that's the problem with the politics, is that politicians aren't experts and they're driving outcomes that are not designed by experts. They're designed by politicians, and it shows.
So how do we actually change that? If we've got some of the experts in the room, how do we get to the point where our politicians are actually working towards the effective solution?
Well, they don't want to get blamed for stuff. So that's the kind of that we always try to sell solutions by saying when we tried to solve privatisation, we said if businesses own the grid and there's a blackout, you can blame businesses. You don't get blamed for it. They quite like that. They sort of, they're drawn to where they're not helped. I mean, and I do think that's informing the kind of nature of the response to the bushfire. Because I think right now if they stood up and said, we're going to make all these changes, they own so much stuff that they don't want to own. They're not actually not responsible for it. So they want to be able to lay it off. That's where I think they won't want to give it to business per se, but I think they want to give it to something that they can see and trust. And the Reserve Bank, to me, the way in which the Reserve Bank changed its operational systems to be freed from government interference and trying to set interest rates was what ended hyperinflation in Australia and around the world. So logically, that kind of thinking, but at a larger scale, will be needed to solve and to get depoliticise the decisions, set the targets, and let the machine operators run the machine. And I think it will go away getting to that point, once you're there, I think it will solve quite quickly. But I think they're anxious about the short-term political consequences of making a decision like that. And they're too rival with each other to align to that. And I don't know what changes, because you'd have thought a bushfire like this might be something that triggered them. No. So
We might have one more down the back.
G'day, my name's Ben. Electrical engineer, so the technical parts of the power system are less complicated to me than the market parts. I wanted to ask you about transmission. I think that a lot of talk goes on about the cost of generation, but it's not the major part of the typical electricity bill. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's 30% for generation and 50% for transmission and distribution together. With the ISP, it's a transmission plan. A lot of multipliers and the supporting equipment as well. What's your thoughts on if there's a technology change in 10 to 15 years? Is that going to be a white elephant potentially? And is that worth considering?
Look, I think transmission is a relatively small part of the bill. It's more the distribution network that's the lion's share. And that makes sense because it's just ubiquitous, it's everywhere. You look out the window, it's kind of running past every street, and there's a cost to maintaining it. And it's higher here in Queensland than it is in, say, places like Victoria, different sorts of grids. I think transmission is actually true. Its cost of building is one thing which, gets out of control, but it's more the consequences of the transmission investment because it doesn't generate any power. It moves it from one place to another. And it's clearly been a critical part of building the NEM, and it's likely to play a critical role in connecting renewables to markets over the next 30 years. So we get all that. But I think there is an open debate about how we do this. There's people criticising the regulatory process for transmission both ways. I look at the RIT process and think I read Electronet's submission to the recent SA New South Wales interconnector, and I I like Electronet, I like these, I know what their business model is a private business. So let's say in Queensland, Powerlink is owned by the same people who own the generators. So at least there's a strategic view on it still, which is the old school. Private businesses owning transmission, their business model for growth is to get more regulated assets built. That's how they do it. And so if you read the RIT, they're saying, well, there may be all these consequential, that we may impair other people's assets to build our asset, but overall we kind of calculate that that's in the net interest of consumers. Now, if you're right, that's terrific. If you're wrong, you're both costing consumers and you're impairing other investment. And I don't know how you solve for that, but you want the right transmission built at the right scale, and yet you don't want to overbuild, but more importantly, you don't want to be sort of crippling investment in other types of parts of the system. And I think there's a genuine discussion about how you do that, given what we're trying to do, which is radically different to the way we built a relatively simple and linear grid in the 20th century. And those guys are going to be busy building lots of transmission lines. Get that? How do you do it so that everybody knows what the game is and banks can invest efficiently in all the assets we need? And it's tough. And that's I don't think the RIT team necessarily meets that criteria. But I don't know how, but I don't have a particularly good idea about how to do it better. But you don't, and you want optimal transmission being built. It's a lumpy asset, just like large coal-fired generators. You don't want to keep adding 100 megawatts of transmission line every couple of years. You need to make those big calls. That's a bit of a, I don't know the answer to that, but it's important.
Okay, so I found that enlightening, so thank you. So our event next month hasn't been finalised, but we're looking to build it around BlackRock's decision to withdraw from coal. So potentially BlackRock, possibly QRC, and someone from the IGCC. We're also looking at talking with a few other people to build our next few seminars. If you've got any ideas about who you'd like us to present, come and have a chat. But for this evening, I'd like to thank Ashurst again for being our venue partner. I'd like to thank you for attending, and I'd also like you to join me in thanking our speaker. Thank you.